Hello, everybody. This is the third part now from the course with Professor Dunne of Foundations of Buddhism, and we're excited to dive in whatever is shared today from the historic to the philosophical background. Let's see where it goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Great to see everybody. I am happy to be continuing this series now. This is part 3. I think we're planning 4 parts, and then we'll see what happens after that. So I don't know that there were any questions written online, but we'll definitely allow time for questions today. One thing I want to ask you some questions, which is, do we remember from last time what the most basic teaching is? The purpose of Buddhism is what? To get rich and famous. No? No? What is it? It's to relieve suffering, right? So that's the baseline, is the relief of suffering, is to achieve freedom. This wonderful Sanskrit word moksha, which also means kind of release, like freedom. Freedom from what? Freedom from suffering. And when we talk about suffering, we refer to this word samsara, which literally means flowing together. And it's kind of the flowing together of our mind-body attributes, of the stuff that makes up mind and body. So, and what causes suffering? To remember that, it's karma and klesha. So klesha means negative mental states, but that's a great word to just remember. It can translate many different ways. Sometimes people say afflicted mental states. Sometimes they say afflicted emotions. But that's not a great translation, because the root cause, there's one klesha, which is said to be, the real troublemaker, the one that is really the root cause of suffering, and that's ignorance or confusion, right? And then that motivates activities that are dysfunctional, that produce karma. And that karma is a kind of conditioning that perpetuates then those kleshas, those negative mental states. But again, the root one, which produces the whole cycle of suffering, is ignorance or confusion about the nature of our own identity. That's the first level of teaching. So we talked about that last time in terms of the Four Noble Truths. And this is the content of what's called the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. And then the second turning of the wheel of Dharma is going to be about the philosophy of emptiness, but also compassion. And then the third turning is going to be really about the nature of the mind, actually. And that's what we'll talk about in our last session. We'll talk about that last kind of turning, if we can say. Remember this gesture, the mudra, the gesture, turning the wheel of Dharma, this gesture. So in a traditional context, when we start a teaching, a Buddhist teaching, we actually would often have a kind of invocation of our lineage, of our teachers. So I'm just going to do that this time to kind of give us a sense of being in that context. So, Viduta Kapana Jala Gambhirudara Murtaye Namaha Samanta Bhadraya Samanta Sparana Tvishe Nabhavo Nabhibhavo Sindhucherunapi Shashvataha Nitjanapi and it's just Twamadaya Namostute. Satan Trikikana Bezagi Dalati Mambarazane Kadantanju Shumlo Tobai Lodro Bobe Nama Zeldus Omajaki Ing Bodane Duzangi Kunging Oni. So, with those invocations, a couple of verses in Sanskrit and a couple in Tibetan, let's begin. And part of when we begin kind of formal teachings, we have some kind of invocation. There's a request to teach also as part of that process. And I'll just assume I've been requested since we already scheduled this. And then also part of what we do is we kind of check our motivation. And that's really relevant where we're talking about the causes of suffering, because also there's the causes of liberation. And part of that is cultivating positive motivations, the motivation, for example, to be free, a natural motivation to be free from suffering. So we check our motivation. Why are we here? Why are we learning about Buddhism? Why are we practicing Buddhism? Of course, to become free of suffering. That's the baseline, right? There's going to be more, but that is the baseline. Okay, so then also from last time, we then talked about how do we relieve suffering? Well, what we're going to do is eliminate the cause. And the cause is ignorance. What counteracts ignorance is wisdom, what we call prajna or prajna, you can also say. Or even Gyan is another word, or Gyan, depending on the pronunciation. And that's, of course, Dharma Gyan. That word Gyan can mean wisdom as well, awareness or wisdom. So in this particular case, the kind of wisdom that counteracts that ignorance is going to be the wisdom that realizes that the kind of self we think we have does not actually exist. Okay? That's what we talked about last time. The kind of self we instinctively feel like we have does not actually exist. That does not mean we don't exist at all, right? It just means that the sense of a particular kind of self, a self that is like unchanging, that is a controller of the mind-body system, an owner of the mind-body system, a single one thing that somehow is constituted by or possesses the mind-body system, right? So that sense of someone like in charge, that there's some little you inside running the show, that is said to be unreal. That kind of self does not exist. And because it doesn't exist, that means that when we are trying to make that kind of self happy, which is what we want to do naturally, that all that we attempt to do fails. And why does it fail? Because we're trying to make something non-existent happy. That makes sense, right? If I say, well, I really would like to paint my square circle red, that's not going to work out too well, is it? Because I can't paint it any color. It's not there. So likewise, that kind of self doesn't exist. So that's basically the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. And then we talked about how in order to cultivate that wisdom, we actually also need meditation. Because meditation is what enables us to get to an experiential level. We all know, many of us, including me, we know like something, we can intellectually know something. For example, we can intellectually know that something is, not healthy to eat too much potato chips or whatever it is, or to drink too much or whatever. We can know that that's not healthy and yet we still do it, right? So we can know things intellectually, but they don't necessarily impact our behavior or the way we feel. And that means that we can intellectually understand something, but we still have kleshas, right? And again, these are more than just afflictive emotions. It's also confusion, right? So that's why it's probably best to just use that word klesha, these sticky negative mental states, problematic mental states. So in order to really uproot those negative mental states, especially confusion or ignorance that is at the root of them all, in order to eliminate that, we have to have something experiential, and that's why we need meditation. So today I want to talk a little bit more about some aspects of meditation and how it relates to the cultivation of wisdom. We remember, of course, that in order to successfully cultivate the kinds of meditative capacities that enable us to have wisdom, we also need to be leading a wholesome lifestyle. And that's one translation, as I said last time, of this word kushala. And that's so being, wholesome activities, wholesome thoughts, wholesome mental states, they are not going to eliminate suffering, right? So one of the confusions one can have in general, and also when one's studying Buddhism, is thinking all I need to do is like just cultivate lots of wholesome states, things like love and compassion, things like generosity. These are definitely positive and they're useful and even necessary for our practice, but they themselves don't eliminate suffering. The only thing that eliminates suffering is wisdom, actually. The wisdom that sees the way things really are. In the context of ourself, it's the wisdom that sees what is my true nature, right? That's what eliminates suffering. But in order to get that, we need meditative concentration. And in order to get that, we have to have a wholesome mind, a mind that's really able to focus, that isn't all chaotic. So that's why it's very important for us to cultivate those positive qualities. Things like love, kindness, generosity, and so on, right? And at the root of this is what we talked about last time is non-harm, right? So the root of that kind of lifestyle is at least not harming people, at least. So with that in place, we can cultivate meditative states that will lead us to wisdom. But what are meditative states, right? Meditation is really important. It's our understanding has to be, wisdom is not just in the head, it's not just intellectual, it's experiential. But what kind of meditation are we talking about? Well, basically, we can think of meditative practices in Buddhism as being in short of two basic kinds. There really are many different kinds of practice. You've maybe heard of metta bhavana, which is the cultivation of loving kindness. You may have heard of practices for cultivating compassion. You may have heard of mindfulness style practices. There are many different styles of practice, kinds of practice. But in a way, they can all be kind of summarized in either practices that are about cultivating what we call shamatha, or calm abiding, or else they're practices that are about cultivating special insight, vipassana, or in the Pali language of the Theravada-Tradition, vipassana, right? So the two kind of basic aspects of meditation, which in fact eventually have to come together. And sometimes we talk about this as being like two wings of a bird. In order to fly, the bird needs both of these. It needs both calm abiding and it needs special insight. In a famous metaphor for this that's found, for example, in a text called the Bhavanakrama, the Stages of Meditation by Kamalashila, the first Indian pundit actually the second Indian pundit to travel to Tibet. It's the idea here is that let's say you're in a cave temple, and there are many cave temples actually in various Buddhist countries, some beautiful ones in India. And when you go, in order to see the amazing murals in the temple, you need a lamp. That lamp needs to be sufficiently bright that you can see the mural. But if it's not stable, if there's wind and it's blowing around, you won't be able to see the mural. So it not only doesn't have to be bright, it also has to be stable. And so that stable, bright flame, so to speak, that's what we need. That's what wisdom is, actually. It's a combination of that lucidity, of that insight, of that brightness, so to speak, and that stability. Both of those are needed. And shamatha styles of practice, what we call calm, abiding practice, are about cultivating stability. And insight practices are about cultivating this brightness, so to speak, this wisdom. And a key aspect in those kinds of practices, so when we do shamatha practices, sometimes we're visualizing something and trying to stabilize the mind on a visualized object. Sometimes we use the breath and we just watch the flow of the breath and simply notice what's happening, paying attention to the flow of the breath as an anchor, you could say, for the attention. When we're trying to cultivate stability, specifically what we're trying to do actually is cultivate mindfulness, something we translate as mindfulness. So this is why you hear mindfulness in Buddhism all the time, why it was from the very beginning, as far as we can tell, such an important style of practice is that without that stability that mindfulness gives us, we are not going to be able to cultivate wisdom at all. Our mind will just be chaotic, right? So we'll have what we call the monkey mind, jumping from place to place, from branch to branch, right? So how do we cultivate this kind of stability? Well, we practice. We do it again and again and again. And as the old saying goes, practice makes perfect. That the more you practice, the better it gets. But what are we trying to practice? Specifically, when we're cultivating mindfulness as a fundamental feature that we need for all meditative states, mindfulness it's a little confusing as a translation. It was translated that way in the 19th century by the Rhys Davids, two very famous British students, scholars of Buddhism. Uh, but it's a little confusing because the actual word in Sanskrit and in the Pali language, remember Pali is used by the contemporary Theravada tradition dating back uh, perhaps all the way to the Buddha. And in that language, they talk about sati, S-A-T-I. And in Sanskrit, which is Pali is derived from Sanskrit. It's kind of a little bit like old Italian and Latin. Uh, in Sanskrit, we say smrti, S-M-R with a dot under it, T-I, smrti. So what does this mean? It actually literally means memory. It means remembering or recollecting. Now, if we translate this as memory, that also gets confusing because in this context specifically, when we're talking about a particular mental function, a certain aspect of the mind, we're talking about a particular capacity that is metaphorically called memory. It's not really memory though. So here's what I mean by that. If I am trying to focus on something, let's say I'm just trying to focus on my breath. I'm trying to settle my mind on my breathing, just noticing the sensations of breathing. If you've ever tried to do that, what happens? If you're like me, eventually, or maybe right away, the monkey mind gets distracted. And like, you get a notification on your phone and you go, oh, what's that? Right? So something captures your attention. You get attention capture, right? That's what we call attention capture is distraction. That's how distraction in Buddhism is defined. Your mind has been captured by something else, by some other object. That's distraction. And what mindfulness does, this mental function, this mental capacity, what we call a cetasika, or a semjung in Tibetan, what this mental capacity does, or this mental function does, is it prevents the mind from being distracted. In other words, it prevents the mind from being captured by something else. Okay? So that capacity to have stability, so that really is about the stability of mind. It is not telling you, is the mind bright? Is the mind clear? It's not telling you how much effort is going on. It's not telling you any of that. It's just saying if that mental function is in place, then the mind is not going to be distracted by something else. So when we're cultivating initially the kind of stability, what we're actually trying to do is cultivate a mind that is stable in this way because it's not caught by other objects. As we will see, that way of thinking about mindfulness is very important because it eventually is going to come out in a form that we call non-dual mindfulness. And that'll be next time we'll talk about that, the idea of non-duality and mindfulness in that context. So when we're cultivating this kind of, initially, that's what we do first for the most part. We don't just try to jump into special insight. Don't just try to jump into cultivating wisdom directly. We first, actually, in terms of our meditation, are going to work on stability. And when we're doing that, there are kind of two basic features that we're looking for. We're looking for the mind to be stable, to have a kind of abiding, if you like, it's stable, but also that it's clear. Because although most of the time when we think of ourselves as, being distracted, of having attention capture, most of the time that's because our minds are a little agitated, right? So agitation is one of the basic kind of obstacles that we face when we're practicing. But the other thing we can get, which many of you may have experienced, I certainly have, very common in the beginning of a kind of mindfulness style retreat is people falling asleep. You see, everyone's like, it's really the classic head bob, and it happens all the time. There is a trick where if you're a monk, you can take your robe and one of my first teachers told me when he was a young monk, he had trouble falling asleep, and then his friend showed him, oh, well, you just kind of put your hand like this and your robe around, no one can see, and it looks like you're meditating, but you're actually asleep. So don't use that trick. The point being, it happens a lot. Even to the best monks, right? You can fall asleep. That's also a kind of distraction, right? Because you've lost the object, right? So when we say that being distracted is attention capture, it also means you've lost the object that you're trying to focus on, or you've lost the state that you're seeking to cultivate. So losing it is like forgetting, and that's why we call keeping it mindfulness or memory, right? So that's why this is a metaphor of memory. I'm remembering the object, or I'm remembering the state that I'm cultivating instead of losing it, forgetting it, so to speak. So two ways we can lose it. One is that object captures our attention, but the other is we can just like fall asleep. And then in that case as well, we've lost what we're doing. We have become lost. So how do we prevent this? Well, we cultivate both stability and clarity. Our stability, and there are various techniques, and we'll talk about them now, but our stability is what enables us to cultivate a kind of mind that's not constantly jumping to other objects. And then clarity helps us to cultivate a mind state that is not so dull that it loses the object, right? So those are two basic features of practice, of meditative practice, especially in the beginning, where we're cultivating a state that is stable and clear at the same time, that has a kind of brightness and a stability. And this is dealing with what we call, the general term in cognitive psychology is what we call arousal. How much energy is there in your mind-body system right now? Are you really hepped up? That means very often the monkey mind is going crazy. Or are you really low and are you therefore almost falling asleep? In that case also, you don't have focus or concentration. So when we have that in place, then we can cultivate wisdom. And the cultivation of wisdom really comes in three forms. Remember, we Buddhists love lists. So what are the three kinds of wisdom that we cultivate? There's the wisdom that comes from learning, the wisdom that comes from reflecting or thinking about what you learned, and then the wisdom that comes in meditation. So first, for example, in the specific context of the wisdom that counteracts the ignorance about my own identity, in that context, what we learn are basically the arguments that say there is no such thing as this kind of self that we seem to have, that we feel like we have. The kind of self that we're trying to make happy doesn't exist. So that's just a claim right now. There are many different ways of examining that question. Like, so if we talk again about this specific kind of self as this kind of unitary, singular, unchanging, absolute, controlling, the perceiver of perceptions, the person behind your eyes, so to speak, right? The thinker of thoughts, the experiencer of experiences, the controller of this system, the boss there somewhere in your mind or your brain or whatever you think it is, that doesn't really exist. And the arguments so what we learn is not just that claim, but then we actually learn arguments and practices that enable us to see if that is really true for ourselves. We start an inquiry. And in early Buddhism, in the first turning of the wheel, that inquiry used a technique that was especially about this mind-body system and looking for, is there anything in the mind-body system that actually could be this kind of self? Something that is unchanging, something that is a controller, something that is absolute, singular, the one true thing that we are. Is there anything in this mind-body system that's like that? And the way we do that is we then, what in early Buddhism provides for us is a kind of map of the mind-body system to look for that sort of self. And that map there are different maps in the different early traditions. They're traditionally said to be 18 different schools. And they have slightly different versions of this. But basically, the idea is that we can summarize this kind of map in what's called the 5 aggregates. It's a very important concept that you may have already seen. The 5 aggregates. So they are the form aggregate, just like the material form that makes up the mind-body system, right? There's the sensation aggregate or feeling aggregate. So the idea here is that each moment of awareness, and awareness or consciousness is a string of moments, one moment after the other, one state of consciousness, 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 going through time, never stopping, even when you sleep, even in dreamless sleep, that stream of consciousness is still occurring. And that stream of consciousness is accompanied by always a sensation or a feeling tone, positive, negative, or neutral. Along with that, there is what's called sanjna, or recognition. And this is a basic faculty of like picking out an object. You can think of it as object selection, right? It's object selection. And then there is contact. So contact, when we're doing that, we have to have contact with the objects that we are experiencing. So we have the form aggregate, we have the feeling aggregate, we have the recognition aggregate, and then we have contact. Contact is actually included in a much larger category of what's called conditioning. So that's the fourth aggregate, conditioning. And it includes things like contact with the object. So again, the form aggregate, the feeling tone aggregate, the recognition or object selection aggregate, a whole bunch of aggregates, including things like contact, that are a whole bunch of mental functions or facets that we call conditioning. That's the fourth aggregate, and there are many different kinds of conditioning. And then finally, consciousness itself. So that's a really basic map. And in that fourth one is where there's a whole lot of different categories. Things like anger, confusion is in there, for example, attachment, aversion. They're all in that fourth aggregate. And you take that basic map and you basically go through your mind-body system. And this is where meditation is important, because you learn the map. So that's the wisdom that comes from learning. But you also need to like experience that map. So you have to have the meditative capacity to examine your own experience. And as we're doing that, then also what comes up as well are arguments around the possibility that all of this stuff together somehow constitutes a self, like it's a whole consisting of various parts. Just like this teacup can be a whole. It says fika in Swedish, which is a word for having a nice afternoon coffee. So you have this whole as a cup. It's got a handle, it's got an inside, an outside, a top, and a bottom. And we say there's one thing here, the cup, composed of parts. But the Buddhist claim here, in this, especially in this first turning of the wheel of Dharma, is that there are actually no wholes. There's just the parts interacting, but there isn't actually one thing here. So for example, so this is an argument that will be used against the idea that there are these aggregates, but they all come together to form one thing, which is the self. And this is famously from an encounter between a Bactrian king, descended from Alexander the Great when he invaded in the northwestern area of South Asia, and a Buddhist monk named Melinda. So this is the famous questions. A Buddhist monk named Nagasena. And so this king, Melinda, or Mithrander was his Greek name, encountered the monk and had asked a bunch of questions. So there's a very famous text called The Questions of King Melinda. And basically, the king says to Nagasena, oh, you say there's no self, but it doesn't make it. Look at me. There's one thing here. And Nagasena says, well, king, you came in a chariot. I guess you think that's one thing, right? There's just one chariot. And the king says, yes, of course, that's right. And then Melinda says, well, is the wheel of the chariot the chariot? And the king says, no. Is the platform the chariot? No. Is the axle the chariot? No. Well, where is the chariot? We can do this with the cup. Is the handle the cup? Is this the cup? Is this the cup? The top the cup? Is the side the cup? If we say the cup is the same as its parts, then the cup is the same as the handle, and it's the same as the sides, and it's the same as the top. If the cup is the same as the top and the same as the handle, then that means the top and the handle are the same, right? A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. It's very clear. So that's arguments. is an argument against the idea, and that doesn't make sense, right? If the top is the handle is the top, then, or if the top is the same as the cup and the bottom is the same as the cup, then that means the top and the bottom are the same. That's not going to work very well for a cup. And I'm not going to turn it upside down now because it has tea in it, but I think you get the point. So this argument, which I'm running through very quickly, is just an example of the kinds of arguments that you also learn. So some of this learning is experiential. You're looking for, is there this kind of self? But then also you're using arguments. And that's especially where reflection comes in, the wisdom that comes from reflection or thinking about what you've learned. And as you work through that kind of argument, which is this is what we call the neither one nor many argument. It's a beautiful argument, very powerful argument to demonstrate that all of these different parts can't constitute one thing. We can conventionally call this a cup. We can conventionally refer to a chariot. We can conventionally talk about a person or even a self, but there isn't really just one thing here. There's a bunch of parts interacting. Okay? So that argument, when you think about it more and more, really you can come to a moment then where, wow, that makes sense, a kind of aha moment. And that is also what then leads you into the experience of wisdom in meditation. So the relationship here between the learning and thinking in meditation is not really kind of a linear experience. Learning also requires some experience. In other words, you don't just hear the words, you also start to examine it in your own experience, in your own consciousness. As you're reflecting, that reflection itself can become a kind of meditative state, right? And when you finally are like really immersed in a meditative experience of, let's say, no self, of recognizing that there isn't self at all, this also then leads to additional reflection later. So it's kind of like a spiral process, so to speak. That's really important in most of the context in Buddhist practice and philosophy. We're kind of on a spiral, like we're going thinking, we're experiencing, we're reflecting, we're using reasoning, then we're just directly experiencing, and that we sort of spiral up, and it's in the sense that our wisdom becomes deeper and deeper. So that is you could say that, remember we had those three trainings, the training in ethics, the training in meditation, and the training in wisdom. And those three really, again, also you can see as being in this kind of not just linear relationship. They feed on to each other. As Buddhism progresses, so that's our first turning of the wheel of Dharma. This is what are called the 18 schools traditionally. Really, there are more than 18, but we refer to 18. Of those schools, they are monastic schools. And each of these has what's called also, so they have their philosophy. They all espouse in some fashion this philosophy of no self, meaning anatman. There is no absolute, unchanging, fixed, singular, controlling self. Okay, there's still experience. All this stuff is happening, but that doesn't mean there's a single thing in there that's kind of you. All right, you are all of it, the whole process. That's fine to say that. So these 18 schools each had their slightly different version of that, slightly different version map that they used of the mind-body system to look for the self, right? Slightly different version. And all of that would be contained in what's called the Abhidharma. Right? So that Abhidharma is an account of the mind-body system, also has cosmology and stuff like that in it. And these kinds of arguments as well are found in the context of what's called the Abhidharma. But also each of these schools had what's called their sutras. So a sutra is probably a word you've heard before. In the Pali language, there's sutta. So the current Theravada school tracks back to a school that in Sanskrit was called the Stavira-Tradition. So that's one of those 18 schools. And they have their own Abhidharma, or in their language, the Pali language, Abhidhamma. So they have suttas, they have Abhidhamma, the kind of philosophy of the mind-body system and so on. They have then their sutras or suttas, which are the discourses given by the Buddha or authorized by the Buddha. It's interesting. especially as we will see as later sutras become revealed. It's not always the case that the Buddha is the one speaking, actually. It can be somebody else, but he sort of authorizes it. He's there and says, say something, or even just inspires someone to say something. So that's a sutra, or sutta in Pali. And a sutra is a discourse spoken by the Buddha or authorized by the Buddha. And they always begin with evam maya shrutam ekasmin samaye in Sanskrit, or the equivalent in Pali, which means, thus have I heard at one time, in a particular place such and such happened. Because it's said to be actually the memory of the Buddha's cousin Ananda, who was also his attendant, that he had a remarkable memory and remembered what the Buddha said. Although interestingly, after the Buddha passed away, and 500 of his greatest disciples gathered to recollect what the Buddha said. At first, they all disagreed, but then when Ananda spoke, they said, "Yeah, I remember that." But one of them stood up and said, "That's not what I heard." And then he went away to the south. They say, who knows what happened to that guy? But so the point here is that the sutras are the discourses of the Buddha as they were recollected by someone. It's a very interesting point. We'll come back to later. And then finally, the third kind of collection of texts are called the Vinaya, or the discipline. So we have the Abhidharma texts, which are like philosophy and the kind of psychology that we were just talking about with the five aggregates, for example. And then we have the sutras, or the discourses. And then we have the discipline, the Vinaya. And these three are called the three baskets. And when we use the word Dharma to refer to the teachings of the Buddha, very often we can say what we mean is the three baskets in terms of the written teaching. As the community develops, you also then have a practice of what's called taking refuge in the Triple Gem. So we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, that is the teaching, as I said, basically the three baskets, at least in the early stage, and then the community, or the Sangha. And I think, as I said the first time, this is what technically makes you a Buddhist, is that just going for refuge is what constitutes you as a member of the Buddhist community. That's it. You don't have to necessarily believe anything or even do anything. Just doing that makes you a Buddhist, taking refuge in the Triple Gem. And so of these three, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, so, there's a famous phrase, Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, I go for refuge in the Buddha, Dharmam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami. Those are in Sanskrit. When we go for refuge in that way, what do you think is the most important refuge? Anyone guess? Is it the Buddha? I can see the Gomde people, they can just raise their hand. Who votes Buddha is most important? Who votes Dharma is most important? Okay, that looks like we're voting for all of them. Who votes Sangha is most important? Nobody thinks the Sangha is important. Sangha could be considered the most important in certain ways. Yeah, this is sort of a trick question, because in different ways you can say each of them is most important. But very often when we ask that question, we say, really, the most important one is the Dharma. But it is not just the words of the text. It's actually the understanding of those words. So in each of these three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we talk about a kind of conventional level of understanding and a higher level of understanding. The Buddha we go for refuge in is even the historical Buddha, but also really at a higher level, we're going for refuge in our own capacity to attain Buddhahood, which we will talk about next time in terms of what we call Buddha nature. So in a way, we're going for refuge in our own Buddha nature. When we go for refuge in the Dharma, it's the text and so on, but really it's the understanding or realization of the meaning of those texts. And when we go for refuge in the community, it's anyone who's become a part of the community, but it's especially the realized people within the community, what we call the Aryas. So as this kind of schema develops, we have the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha taking refuge in the Triple Gem, but then an emphasis on the importance of the teaching, that without the teaching, you can't have Buddhas. If there are no Buddhas, there is no Sangha, right? The teaching actually, in a sense, is most important because the Buddha himself became a Buddha because someone taught him the Dharma, right? So this is the idea of the passing along of the teaching is so critically important. And when we think about the teaching, one of the elements that I mentioned earlier is the idea that you teach something to people that is most appropriate to them. You teach them what they need in order to progress. And so really right from the beginning, there's this idea that the teaching is not just a kind of absolute truth, but it's really about audience as well. You have to teach in accord with the audience. And that means that there's an opportunity to have new kinds of teaching become revealed. And this leads us then to the second turning of the wheel of Dharma. So the second turning is said to, so the first turning occurred in outside of the ancient city of Benares in a place called Sarnath, in we know as the Deer Park in Sarnath, and you can visit that in this beautiful place. There's a museum as well. And the second turning of the wheel occurred actually not far from where the Buddha attained awakening, and not far from what later became the most famous monastery called Nalanda. And the Nalanda tradition is something very important. We'll come back, we'll talk about next time when we talk about the third turning. So the second turning is really was taught in Vulture's Peak, as it's known, Gurdakurta, near the city of Rajgir. So this teaching is about the teaching of emptiness. It is a teaching that is traditionally said to have been taught at the time by the Buddha, and then it was hidden because basically the world wasn't ready to hear it. One of the core teachings, sutras in this body of literature, in the second turning of the wheel, is called the Heart Sutra. Some of you may have heard of that, the Heart Sutra, which of course also begins, evam maya shrutam kasmin samaye. At a particular time, this is what I heard when the Buddha was in Rajagurha and so on, right? And in Tibetan, we recite that very often. So that text is kind of probably the best known text in this collection that's called the Perfection of Wisdom texts. So the second turning of the wheel is about that. It's about the perfection of wisdom, or prajna paramita. Prajna is that word for wisdom. So in these texts, what we're going to find is that traditionally we say they were taught by the Buddha, but they were not revealed, so to speak, in public until around the year 0. So a certain kind of change occurs at this time where certain aspects of early Buddhism are going to be not exactly modified, but they're going to be sort of expanded on, and some new directions become publicly available. Again, the tradition would say they were always there. Maybe that guy who walked off to the south had heard those sutras, the perfection of wisdom, and that's why he left. Who knows? But the perfection of wisdom texts become available kind of historically around the year 0, more or less. And those texts, one of the key aspects of those texts has to do with a reimagining of what nirvana is. So remember, in the four truths, we have the truth of suffering. We have to recognize suffering. We have to eliminate the origin, which is basically karma and klesha, specifically the klesha that is ignorance. That enables us to attain the truth of cessation, which is nirvana. And we do that by practicing the path. Now, in the early version of nirvana, there were different debates and so on, but basically nirvana was understood primarily as just the stopping of samsara, putting an end to samsara. And therefore, when someone attained that state and they were still alive, they were said to be in a state of nirvana with a remainder, which the remainder was their mind-body system. Where did the mind-body system come from? Well, It was produced by karma and klesha, like everything else. And so when they die, then they're said to be in a state of nirvana without a remainder. What happens after that? That was a question that the Buddha famously said you shouldn't ask. There's no point in trying to ask that question. What happens after nirvana? But eventually, actually, they do respond to this question, the Buddhist communities. And they say they are starting around the year 0 or so, the idea of nirvana begins to change. Instead of nirvana being like the opposite of samsara, nirvana becomes what you could think of as the transformation of samsara. Another way to think about it is that on the one hand, there's the world of suffering. On the other hand, there's a kind of nirvana, which is the cessation, like its opposite. And the new version of nirvana is neither of those. It's what's called an unlocated nirvana. So the kind of nirvana that a Buddha obtains is an unlocated nirvana. And in this sense, then, the Buddha is not in samsara, but a Buddha also is not in that kind of cessation style of nirvana, which means that the Buddha is still present in the world. And we see that then. Early depictions of the Buddha don't show him there anymore. They just show his footprints, or they show the empty throne under the Bodhi tree where he obtained awakening, but he's not there. The throne's empty. And then starting around the year 100, you start to see statues of the Buddha. So in a sense, he's like back, right? There he is. So that sense, like the change in nirvana, is one of the key changes that happens during this period. And this leads to what's, along with the perfection of wisdom literature, what's also emerging then is this idea of what we call the Mahayana, the great vehicle. And so the tradition practiced at Gomde is called the great vehicle. And the key, one of the changes is a change in the conception of nirvana. Nirvana is not escape anymore, it's transformation. A key in the focus of the kind of practitioner. In the early style, the kind of ideal practitioner is a monk or a nun, is someone who's renounced the world and is living in the monastic lifestyle. But as the Mahayana emerges, the key practitioner now is not someone who's necessarily a monk. They might be a monk, but what they need to be is what's called a bodhisattva. A being, a sattva, who is intent on attaining awakening, bodhi, a bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva is someone who has bodhicitta, which means awakening mind. And what is that? Basically, it's the aspiration to become a Buddha, to become fully awakened in order to alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings. So it is this motivation of what we call great compassion. And that's the key in this second turning of the wheel of Dharma. The philosophy is emptiness, but the practice is actually of great compassion. It's the practice of awakening mind. And so the bodhisattva figure kind of becomes the new paradigm for practice. Could be a monk or not, but doesn't actually have to be. And there are some famous sutras in which the great practitioners are actually not monks and nuns. They are lay people. So one of the most famous of these is the Vimalakirti Sutra, the holy teachings of Vimalakirti. And in this context of the second turning of the wheel, as we're cultivating wisdom, we're also cultivating a different kind of wisdom. And I'll briefly say this, and then we'll take a couple of minutes for questions, because this is where we'll pick up next time. If samsara is produced by karma and klesha, and if even not just our mind-body system, but the world we live in is actually the result of karma and klesha, and that's the idea that yes, it is, right? Even the physical world has been shaped by the karma of the beings in it. The universe itself is a product of their karma. Then, in that case, since that karma was produced through ignorance, that means all of the stuff of the world is contaminated by ignorance. And just like, you can't take an apple seed and just say, oh, I'm going to make an orange tree out of this. That doesn't work. It's the nature of the apple seed is to produce apple trees, not oranges. The nature of karma, which is produced through ignorance, is to produce more samsara. It can't produce anything else. So if all the stuff of the world, my mind-body system, and even the whole cosmos, is the product of ignorance, is produced through ignorance, and if it really is that way, that's its nature, then the only choice is escape, right? You're like stuck. There's nothing you can do. But if the mind stuff of the mind-body system, and of the world too, but especially the stuff of the mind-body system, is not fixed in its nature. It's not like it's an apple seed that can only do one thing, but actually that it has a completely open nature, so to speak, that it is empty of a fixed nature. That's that term, emptiness. Remember, the philosophy of emptiness, or shunyata in Sanskrit. If it's empty of a fixed nature, that means it can be transformed. So when that idea of nirvana changes, and the practitioner now is not someone who's trying to escape, but someone who's trying to engage, the bodhisattva is not trying to escape from samsara, they're trying to transform samsara. That means that samsara has to be transformable. And in order for samsara to be transformable, what does that mean? That means it can't be fixed in its nature. It can't be fixed by its causal past. It has to have a kind of infinite openness, which is what we describe as emptiness. It's empty of a fixed nature. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist at all. We'll talk more about this next time. Emptiness doesn't mean nothingness. Emptiness just means that a thing, whatever it is, let's take our cup, for example. When I say, what is a cup really? Well, it's a bunch of atoms. So what are the atoms really? Well, it's a thing that's produced by previous atoms, or it's got this structure and that structure. Every time I try to talk about something, I end up talking about something else, right? When I try to describe the cup in itself, I talk about atoms or parts or whatever. I talk about an atom, then I talk about its parts or its causal history. So the idea here is when you try to put your finger on something, to identify what it really is, you kind of end up talking, pointing to something else. That's the basic idea of emptiness. It's empty of something fixed because it's interdependent. It depends on other things, right? So just like the cup is made out of non-cup elements to invoke the memory of Thich Nhat Hanh, the great teacher, the self is made of non-self elements, right? Everything is that way. Everything is empty and interdependent. Or another way to say it is, it's empty because it's interdependent, and it's interdependent. The only way it can be interdependent is if it's empty. A thing that is not empty is fixed in its absolute nature, and it can't actually connect, therefore. We'll talk more about that next time. But if you think about that, something that's totally fixed in its identity, completely kind of closed, how does it connect? If it's completely isolated in its own identity, how could it possibly connect? But if it's empty, it doesn't have that kind of fixed absolute identity, then that means it's always connecting. So that's a key part of this change. As the Mahayana, the great vehicle, is emerging, what comes with that is a change in the style of practice, a practice that's now not about escape, but about transformation, a practice that's about the bodhisattva, but also a change in philosophy that goes with that, which is that the world can be infinitely transformed. The individual can be infinitely transformed. The only hope is not escape, it's transformation. And that's transformation into what? Into full Buddhahood. And as you might recall, the difference between someone who's just obtained nirvana and someone who on top of that is a Buddha is that a Buddha can teach. A Buddha has the capacity to teach with maximal efficacy. It's really good at understanding where people are coming from and teaching them really effectively. Well, that's it for today. I'm going to give you 5 minutes for questions. Not very long, but I did want to get us through at least the second part of the second turning. We'll come back and talk about the second turning a little more, and then we'll focus on the third turning and how that leads to the tradition that we find at Gomde. Please feel free now to ask some questions, but also to note down any questions you have and be sure to put them online in our Google group so that we can keep track of them and answer any questions you have. Okay, so let's see. Anyone questions? You can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand if you're online. Anybody?
I did find some in the document that I copy now in the chat. I think some people were just very on time with adding them.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yes, please.
yes.
Okay.
Two
When you
questions.
talk about reincarnation in Buddhism, the consciousness of karma that is still existing further on, why is there no believing in a soul that gets reborn? Yes, great. I'm glad you asked that question because I was going to talk about it and I didn't. So, very briefly, this is if a river, would it be sensible to say, let's say we're, on the Danube and we're on the southern part and we see the river coming down and I say, oh, that's the northern part of the Danube. That wouldn't really make sense, right? Like it's the same river, but to say that it's the same exact stuff doesn't make any sense. It's a flow. So the flow of the river, the fact that the river can flow doesn't mean that there has to be something that is exactly identical about every point of the river, right? A flow is not doesn't require some kind of absolute thing that is the same. So likewise, the flow of the mind-body system continues in some fashion, in what we can call in the continuance of consciousness in a certain way. So we can talk more about that next time, about some details. But the basic idea is that consciousness continues, but it continues in the way a river continues. So you don't need a soul, actually, in order for that, to think of it in those terms, as a process like a river that is continuing, a causal process, actually, that is continuing. I hope that makes sense. Feel free to debate that with me next time, or even now. Since Buddhism emphasizes direct experience, mindfulness, seeing reality clearly as it is, how is it that it also accommodates beliefs in concepts like rebirth and afterlife, different realms like hungry ghosts, which are quite supernatural? From what I understand, it comes from earlier local tradition beliefs that weren't really questioned by Buddha at the time. How do these traditional supernatural elements continue to be accepted today? And how do they coexist with Buddhism emphasis on rational experiential understanding? So I think rebirth actually is the claim will be that you can rationally make sense of rebirth, and there is definitely, I think, even a trivial way in which you have to say that there's a kind of continuity of consciousness. That doesn't necessarily amount to the Buddhist version of rebirth, but the idea that somehow consciousness is coming from nowhere and going nowhere, it really doesn't work for humans. There are ways in which we are, for example, one way to think about this kind of continuity is actually in terms of culture, interestingly enough. But also, depending on who you talk to currently in terms of culture is kind of like karma, you could say, a collective karma. But also, when we think about consciousness itself, the most prominent theory of consciousness right now, which is called integrated information theory, is a form of panpsychism. And you may not be familiar with that term, but basically, these are scientists who are pretty physicalist about things, but they also think that consciousness is a fundamental element of the universe. So the only way to make sense of consciousness is that it's always there. So obviously, in a trivial way, there's therefore also continuity. So that doesn't mean that IIT and the main scientist, Giulio Tononi, is actually here at my university and I work with him. Doesn't mean that, Giulio accepts rebirth. But what it does show you is that the basic idea of continuity in itself is not incoherent at all. In terms of supernatural, that's an interesting term. That what really constitutes the natural and the supernatural is a fascinating question. Was it Arthur C. Clarke, I think, said any sufficiently advanced technology looks like magic to us. the where you draw that line is actually quite intriguing. Lots of what we think of as natural now would appear supernatural a few hundred years ago, and vice versa. Uh, so on that category is kind of in a way a little problematic. But what I will say about it is that the Buddhist concept, and this is also a big part of the second turning of the wheel, the concept of teaching, as I already said, is kind of you teach in a way that makes sense to people. And in the second turning of the wheel, what you're basically going to find in the philosophy of emptiness and the perfection of wisdom, you're going to find texts that quite literally say, none of these texts are ultimately true. That's that's the point. None of them are ultimately true. So why are you saying anything? Because it's what they call an upaya, a method, right? So methods are needed, conventions, ways of speaking, language, concepts, but they're not ultimately real. They are empty of having kind of that ultimate essential kind of identity. So, whatever cosmology we come up with, I mean, I work with astrophysicists in certain contexts, and I kind of tease them that, the Big Bang is just as much as the supernatural thing as God. And that makes some of them very angry, but actually, some of them agree. It's like, yeah, it's a hypothesis. It's not like this is not, the only story, so to speak. And there are, of course, multiple versions, right? There's the expanding universe, and the oscillating universe, and all that. So I think it, I guess the point I'm trying to make is we have different ways of speaking that are necessary to talk to people, and they're at a certain level not really that important. So if you don't like certain types of what you think are supernatural beliefs, then yeah, you don't need to endorse them. But deciding what really matters and what doesn't matter is not always an easy task. Okay, I am already over time. It's so much, it's a great question, whoever asked it, and there's a lot more we could say about that. But for now, I think unless there's any more questions, and please do drop more questions in for next time. Maybe we'll start with a few questions next time, actually start with some questions, and then we'll talk about the third turning and non-dual wisdom and the Buddha nature and all that good stuff. All right. So so also traditionally at the end we will dedicate our merit. So what this means is we kind of we're taking like what's positive about what we've done, and we're sort of putting it in the bank for our own awakening, so to speak, and dedicating it to what we wish to accomplish. And in the context of the Mahayana, which is what Gomde's tradition is, part of the Mahayana, which is the practice of the Bodhisattva. Of course, what we're aspiring to is to become awakened, to help all beings relieve their suffering. So, with that in mind, I'll do the Tibetan version because I don't know the English. Sonandi tanje zibani totne nye benjana pamje ne kiega naje bala juba yi sibe zole drowa drowa sho. Tumba jiten kanso jumbo dan tempa ne yu shindu sawa da tenzen poner shindu tumba yi tempa yunri ne bita shi sho.